I was celebrating our anniversary with my wife, but when I found out that she was cheating on me on our most important holiday, I decided to take revenge in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life. Now I will tell you how it happened. Our 10th anniversary. I'd been counting down to it like a kid waiting for Christmas, planning everything to surprise Rachel. I pictured her face lighting up when she saw what I'd prepared. The reservations at the nicest restaurant in town, the bottle of her favorite wine, the little notes I'd left around the house that hinted at even more surprises. It was the kind of night I thought we'd both remember for the rest of our lives. Funny how things turn out. When I arrived at the restaurant, it was just before 6:30 p.m. I wanted to be there first, to see her reaction as she walked in. But by 7 o'clock, she still wasn't there. I ordered a glass of water, glancing around, feeling my stomach twist. Rachel was always punctual, the type who'd set alarms and reminders for every little thing. I sent her a quick text, just something casual. On my way? The response came 15 minutes later. Sorry, babe. Work ran late. Be there soon. I didn't like the tone. It felt flat, almost rehearsed. Rachel wasn't one to keep things short with me, especially on a night like this. But I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. She had been under pressure lately, handling a huge event for one of her clients, a big-name corporate type who demanded impossible timelines. The work was grueling, but she'd wanted this promotion badly. It wasn't until 7:30 that she finally walked in. There was a faint, unfamiliar perfume in the air as she leaned in to kiss me, a scent I didn't recognize. Her hair was slightly disheveled, cheeks flushed. She laughed it off, explaining that traffic had been a nightmare. Still, as she sat down, I couldn't help but notice how she avoided my eyes, like she was focused on the table settings instead of me. Sorry to keep you waiting, she said, brushing a hand through her hair. You're so sweet for planning this. I forced a smile, swallowing the nagging feeling creeping up on me. You know I'd wait all night. Our anniversary dinner started normally enough, though there was a strange distance between us. She seemed distracted. As we moved from appetizers to the main course, I tried my best to brush off my unease. Maybe she was just exhausted. Then, halfway through dinner, her phone buzzed. Rachel glanced at it, then quickly flipped it face down. I was used to her being attentive, especially on nights like this, so the gesture struck me as odd. Everything all right? I asked, keeping my voice light. She hesitated, then gave a half-hearted laugh. Oh yeah, just work stuff. Nothing that can't wait. I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, but a chill settled over me. When she excused herself to use the restroom, I took a deep breath and glanced down at her phone, still sitting on the table. I hadn't snooped before, but tonight something gnawed at me. I tapped the screen, and there it was, a message preview from someone named Ben. I froze, staring at the words. Last night was unforgettable. Can't wait for more. My stomach twisted, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, the kind of blow that takes all the air out of you. Every little odd moment, every second of hesitation in her voice suddenly came crashing down, making terrible sense. Rachel returned, smiling like everything was fine, but I saw it now, the forced laugh, the evasive eyes. She was trying too hard, and I couldn't help but wonder just how long she'd been keeping this up. I sat there, trying to smile, nodding to her stories about work, pretending to enjoy the rest of the evening. My mind was racing, piecing things together, reliving moments I hadn't thought twice about until now. That night, after we got home, she fell asleep almost immediately. I lay beside her in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind churning. Every fiber of me wanted to wake her up, to demand an explanation. But deep down, I knew that a simple confrontation wasn't enough. The betrayal was raw, but I needed to do something that would make her understand exactly what she had done to us. The idea took shape slowly, something dark, something I never would have imagined myself thinking. But that night, as I listened to her breathing next to me, my anger morphed into something cold and calculating. I would take my time. She'd feel the weight of every lie, every betrayal. And when I was done, she'd know exactly what it was like to lose everything she thought she had. In that silence, my plan began to take form. The days following our anniversary were a surreal blur. I felt like I was living two lives, maintaining the facade of a loving husband while underneath. My mind churned with plans for revenge. Every morning I'd kiss Rachel goodbye as she left for work, telling her I loved her, pretending that nothing was wrong. And every day, I became more focused, more driven. If she thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. The first step was simple. I had to confirm my suspicions, gather concrete evidence. Maybe it was the architect in me, but I wanted every piece to fit perfectly. I needed the truth to be undeniable, so when everything came crashing down, there'd be no escape for her. Rachel's routine hadn't changed much, and over the next week, I started to pick up on the small, telling details. She'd come home late twice that week, her eyes darting when I asked about her day. Each time, she'd give the same excuse: work ran late. A common line, but the more she used it, the hollower it sounded. One evening, I decided to see just how far she'd take it. Over dinner, I leaned forward, keeping my tone casual. "I was thinking maybe I could stop by your office tomorrow," I said. "Surprise you for lunch." She froze, a brief flicker of panic flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with a smile. "Oh, that's sweet, but I have back-to-back meetings all day. It would probably just be rushed." I nodded, acting as if I bought her excuse. But inside, the pieces continued falling into place. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Rachel left around her usual time, dressed a little more carefully than she used to. Hair perfectly styled, that faint, new perfume clinging to her like a secret. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I kept a careful distance, watching her car weave through traffic, winding through the downtown streets. Eventually, she pulled up to a hotel. Not her office. A sleek, upscale hotel that looked out of place in our modest part of town. I parked a block away and watched from a distance as she got out of her car, glancing around before heading inside. She didn't look like someone rushing to a business meeting. She looked like someone with something to hide. My fists clenched as I sat there, watching the doors, imagining her meeting him inside. The thought filled me with rage, but I kept myself steady, focused. I couldn't blow my cover, not yet. I had to be smart. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures of her as she walked into the hotel. I waited, noting the time, watching the revolving door spin round and round as people entered and left, my mind churning. After about an hour, she finally came out, her expression soft, a small smile on her lips. It was a look I hadn't seen in a long time, a look reserved for someone else now. She drove off, oblivious, and I sat there for a moment, letting the bitterness settle in. But the sight only fueled my determination. I knew now, without a doubt, that my suspicions were true. Over the next week, I began tracking her more carefully. She'd slip out for lunch breaks that were far too long, run errands after work, all while I collected the proof I needed. My phone became a hidden archive of her betrayal, photos of her walking into the same hotel, time-stamped messages she thought I'd never see. And the more evidence I gathered, the colder my anger became, solidifying into something darker, something that would make her understand the depth of what she'd done. The final piece fell into place one evening when she left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter. She was taking a shower, and I knew I had only minutes, but that was all I needed. I unlocked her phone, heart pounding, and went straight to her messages. There it was, a string of texts between her and Ben, as blatant and shameless as anything I'd ever seen. "Ben, can't stop thinking about last night. When can we meet again? Rachel, I'll figure something out. Just have to be careful with Kyle around." I felt a strange satisfaction reading it, even as my anger reached a new height. Now, there was no turning back. My mind was set. The next day, I took the first real step in my plan. I reached out to someone I knew Rachel wouldn't expect, her mother, Claire. We'd always been close, ever since Rachel and I first started dating. She'd always treated me like family, and I knew that despite everything, she cared about me deeply. "Hey, Claire," I said when she picked up. I did my best to keep my voice steady. "I wanted to talk to you about Rachel. It's serious." Over the phone, I heard her take a sharp breath. "What's going on, Kyle? Are you all right?" I hesitated, then spoke in a low, careful tone. "I think Rachel's been unfaithful. I wanted to tell you first, because I know how close you two are. But I also think you deserve to know. I have proof, Claire, and I'd like you to see it." There was a pause, a silence filled with the weight of what I just said. Claire's voice, when she finally responded, was quiet but resolute. "Send me what you have, Kyle. I'm coming over." An hour later, we sat together in the living room, the photographs, texts, and timestamps spread out before us like pieces of a dark puzzle. Claire's face was ashen as she looked over the evidence, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't believe this," she whispered, her voice hollow. "She's been lying to everyone." "I wanted you to see it before I confronted her," I said quietly. "She's your daughter, and I know this isn't easy." Claire looked up at me, a mixture of pain and determination in her eyes. "Thank you, Kyle. You didn't deserve this, and neither did I." As she left, I felt the first hint of satisfaction settle in my chest. My plan was unfolding, each piece falling perfectly into place. By the time I was finished, Rachel would know exactly what it felt like to lose everything. In the following days, I continued putting my plan into motion, sharing the evidence with carefully selected people in Rachel's life. Her close friends, her sister, people who trusted her, who'd been there for us through thick and thin. One by one, they received anonymous packages, each one containing a carefully curated set of photos and messages, just enough to show them the truth without tipping them off to my involvement. And each night, I came home, kissed her cheek, and played the part of the loving husband. The satisfaction I felt grew with every piece of evidence I shared, every life I touched with the truth. Rachel had built her web of lies, and now it was collapsing around her. She just didn't know it yet. By the end of the week, I could see it in Rachel's eyes, the faint, flickering sense that something was wrong, like the first crack in a dam. Her phone buzzed more often, her brow creased as she read messages. Sometimes she'd dart off to another room to take a call, her voice low and tense. She hadn't told me about these calls, and I didn't ask. I let her feel the unease, the slight panic that I hoped would grow. I knew that her closest friend, Jenna, had received the package 2 days ago, and Claire had no doubt spoken to her other daughter, Meredith. The phone calls she was getting now were likely confrontations, subtle hints from her inner circle. Each one was a small fissure, eroding her confidence. On Friday night, I got home earlier than usual, wanting to see her unravel up close. I opened the door and found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of wine, staring at the countertop. Her face was pale, eyes hollow. "Hey," I said, slipping off my jacket and tossing it over the back of a chair. "Rough day?" She looked up sharply, as if she hadn't heard me come in. Her expression shifted, pulling her mask back on, but the effort was strained. "Oh yeah, just work stuff," she said, attempting a weak smile. "You know how it is." I nodded, moving to pour myself a drink. I could feel her watching me, her gaze lingering as if she wanted to say something, to confide. But I kept my distance, letting her stew in the silence. Whatever she was feeling, it was only the beginning. The following Monday, her mother called me directly. I'd expected as much. Claire's loyalty was a double-edged sword, one that I knew would work in my favor once I'd shown her the truth. "Kyle, it's Claire," she said, her voice tense. "I just spoke to Rachel. She was trying to brush off everything you showed me, insisting that it's all a misunderstanding. I thought maybe you and I could talk in person." "Of course," I replied, my voice calm. "Tonight?" She agreed, and I planned to leave work early, ready to take this one step further. That evening, Claire came over, her face a mask of quiet fury. She stepped inside, clutching a manila envelope in her hand, the same one I'd given her days earlier. She held it up, the corners slightly crumpled. "She tried to tell me it was all a mistake," Claire said bitterly, "that this was some kind of setup. I told her I'd seen the text myself. I know she's lying, Kyle." I nodded, my gaze steady. "I'm sorry, Claire. I never wanted you to be hurt by this, but you deserve the truth." She looked away, her mouth pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I could see the heartbreak in her eyes. "And what are you going to do about it? Are you going to tell her that you know?" "Not yet," I said, my voice low. "I think she needs to feel the weight of what she's done first." I want her to face this on her own, to feel what it's like to be truly isolated. Claire nodded slowly, understanding. She's going to hate me. But if it means she'll finally face the truth, then maybe it's worth it. She left a few minutes later, and as the door closed behind her, a sense of finality settled over me. The stage was set. All I had to do was wait for the storm to break. The next morning, Rachel was a wreck. She stumbled into the kitchen, her hair tangled, her face pale. She barely looked at me as she poured herself coffee, her hand shaking slightly as she held the mug. "You okay?" I asked, feigning concern. She forced a smile, her eyes hollow. "Yeah, just exhausted." I nodded, playing my part. "I thought you were going to take it easy this week." She didn't respond, just took a sip of her coffee, staring into the distance. I could tell she was reeling, trying to keep up appearances, but her mask was slipping. The weight of her own secrets was pressing down on her, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she cracked. That night, as we sat on the couch, her phone buzzed again. She flinched, glancing at it before quickly setting it face down, as if hiding it would somehow make the world go away. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, noting every nervous gesture, every stolen glance. She was unraveling, and it was glorious to see. Around midnight, I went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As I passed the doorway to the living room, I heard her voice, low and frantic, murmuring into the phone. I stopped, listening from the shadows. "Ben, this can't go on," she was whispering. "People are starting to find out, and I don't know how. My mom's furious, and Jenna barely looked at me today. I can't handle this." She paused, her voice shaking. "No, you don't get it. This could ruin everything." There was a long silence, and I imagined Ben trying to calm her, whispering reassurances she could cling to. The irony of it all was almost poetic. She had no idea that the man she was running to was just as guilty as she was, a partner in her lies. As she hung up, she sat there, staring into the darkness, the phone clutched in her hand. I slipped back into the bedroom, feeling a strange satisfaction settle over me. It was working. She was beginning to feel the pressure, to see her life fraying at the edges. All she needed was one final push. The following evening, I sat her down at the kitchen table, where everything had started, and watched her as she twisted her hands nervously. I could see her pulse beating rapidly at her throat, her eyes darting around, unable to meet mine. "Rachel," I said, my voice calm and steady, "is there something you want to tell me?" Her eyes widened slightly, her face going pale. What do you mean?" I leaned forward, watching her squirm. "I've noticed you've been distant. I can't help but feel like there's something going on. Something you're not telling me." She opened her mouth, then closed it, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her voice was barely a whisper. I've just been stressed with work. That's all." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "I hope that's all it is, Rachel. Because if there's more, well, I just hope you be honest with me." She looked down, her face ashen, and in that moment, I saw the fear, the doubt creeping into her mind. She was starting to understand, to feel the weight of her lies pressing down on her. The walls were closing in, and she had nowhere left to hide. As she sat there, staring at her hands, I knew that the final blow was near. All it would take was one more step, and she'd be trapped, caught in the very web she'd spun. And I'd be there to watch it all fall apart. By the next morning, Rachel looked like a shell of the woman I had known. She'd barely slept, and the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. I'd let her torture herself long enough. Now it was time for her to experience the full impact of what she'd done. I waited until she left for work, then made my final preparations. I'd saved the most damning evidence for last. A single flash drive filled with every message, every photo, every piece of proof I'd collected. I placed it in a small envelope, sealing it with a simple note inside. "You think no one will find out? Think again." No signature, no return address. Just enough to make her feel like her world was teetering on the edge. Once she was gone, I dropped the envelope into our mailbox and texted her, asking her to check it on her way home. I could practically feel her nerves from miles away, her mind spiraling with possibilities. I had set the stage, and she was walking straight into it. That afternoon, I got a call from Jenna, her best friend. She rarely called me directly, and as soon as I answered, I could hear the mix of anger and hurt in her voice. "Kyle," she began, "I don't know if you've heard, but there's something going on with Rachel. I don't even know how to say this." "What is it?" I asked, feigning ignorance, masking the satisfaction building in my chest. "It's just," she hesitated, clearly struggling to find the words. "We found out that Rachel, she's been seeing someone else." I can't believe it myself, but I saw the proof, and Claire confirmed it. Are you okay?" I allowed myself a brief pause, as if the news was a blow I was processing for the first time. I didn't know, but I had a feeling. Jenna's voice softened, guilt mixing with her anger. "I can't believe she'd do this to you. She always made it seem like you two were perfect together." I don't know what to say. "You don't have to say anything," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I appreciate you letting me know, Jenna. I really do." We ended the call, and I felt a sense of satisfaction settle in. The story was spreading, piece by piece, each person beginning to turn away from her, the circle of trust she'd taken for granted crumbling around her. I could only imagine the anxiety she must be feeling, the paranoia, knowing people were whispering about her, questioning her every word. But the best part was yet to come. That evening, Rachel came home, her expression tense and guarded, as if expecting to walk into a confrontation. I greeted her as usual, acting as though everything was normal, watching her flinch slightly under my calm gaze. As she went to the kitchen, she noticed the envelope I'd left on the counter with her name on it. She stared at it for a moment, hesitant, before picking it up. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. I watched from the hallway, hidden from view, as she pulled out the flash drive and the note. Her face drained of color as she read the single line. For a long moment, she just stood there, frozen, the enormity of what she held sinking in. I could see her mind working, the panic rising, trying to make sense of the threat. She had no idea where it came from, no way of knowing who might be watching, who might already know her secret. The paranoia was written all over her face, each breath shallow and labored. I stepped into the kitchen, feigning casual interest. "Everything all right?" She jumped, quickly tucking the flash drive into her pocket, her smile forced. "Oh yeah, just, some junk mail." I nodded, my gaze piercing. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." She laughed, but it was a hollow, brittle sound. "Just long day. I'm fine." I didn't press her further, letting her stew in the silence. She excused herself early, claiming exhaustion, but I knew better. The envelope had done its job. She'd spend the entire night wondering, questioning everything and everyone, feeling trapped by the walls she'd built. The next morning, she was quiet at breakfast, her eyes distant. I could tell she was barely holding it together, her hands shaking slightly as she sipped her coffee. I decided it was time for the final push. "Rachel," I said, my voice calm and measured, "is there anything you want to tell me?" She froze, her eyes widening slightly. What do you mean?" I looked her in the eye, unblinking. "You've been distant lately. I feel like there's something going on that you're not telling me." Her face turned ashen, and she swallowed hard. "Kyle, I held up a hand, silencing her. "I know everything, Rachel. The texts, the trips, the lies." My voice was cold, each word like a hammer blow. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean. It wasn't supposed to." "You didn't mean to get caught," I corrected, my voice icy. "You didn't mean for people to find out that you were sneaking around with him. But you did. And now everyone knows." She shook her head, the tears spilling over as she reached for me. "Please, Kyle, just let me explain. I was going through so much, and he was there, and I was weak. But it didn't mean anything. I love you, I swear." "Save it," I snapped, stepping back, her touch repulsive now. "You think I want your excuses? That I want to hear how sorry you are? It's too late for that, Rachel." Her face crumpled, and she sank into the chair, sobbing, the weight of her lies crashing down on her. I let her cry, Let her feel every ounce of the guilt and shame she tried to ignore. There was no pity left in me, no compassion. Only the cold satisfaction that she was finally facing the reality she tried to hide. When she finally looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with desperation, she whispered, What happens now?" I leaned in, my voice low and filled with a calm fury. "Now, you deal with the consequences. I'm leaving, and I'm taking everything with me." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. You can't just leave. We can fix this, Kyle, please." I shook my head. "You've destroyed any chance we had. There's no fixing this. Not anymore." I turned and left the room, ignoring her pleas as she begged me to stay, to forgive her. But there was nothing left to forgive. She betrayed me, betrayed us, and now she'd live with the fallout. As I packed my things and left that night, I felt a strange, liberating calm settle over me. The house, the life we'd built together, it was all hers now. But it was a hollow shell, filled only with memories of what we'd once had. And she'd have to live in it, alone, facing the wreckage of her own choices. By the time I walked out the front door, I was free. As I walked away from the house that night, a heavy weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear, my path free of the tangled lies Rachel had woven around us. My life, once tightly intertwined with hers, was now severed, and I felt a strange sense of exhilaration at the prospect of a fresh start. I stayed at a friend's place for a few days while I got things sorted. The messages kept coming, Rachel pleading, her words oscillating between desperation and apology, her calls going unanswered. I didn't need to hear them. I'd said all I needed to, left her to face the fallout of her choices. But I'd be lying if I said it was easy. In the quiet of the nights, the silence would settle in, filling the space where her laughter, her voice, her presence had been. I would stare at the ceiling, remembering the woman I'd once loved, and it hurt. The betrayal cut deep, and though the satisfaction of my revenge was real, so was the hollow ache that filled me now. On the third day, I decided to go back to the house one last time, to collect a few things and settle unfinished matters. I didn't tell Rachel I was coming. I wanted to slip in, grab my things, and leave before she'd have the chance to twist the knife with more words. I pulled up to the house just as twilight was beginning to settle, casting the neighborhood in a soft, eerie glow. The place looked strange to me now, as though it belonged to someone else, a shadow of the life I'd thought I'd be living. I entered quietly, moving through the familiar rooms as memories flooded back. Moments from our early years together, the little quirks we'd loved, the laughter that once filled these walls. In the living room, I stopped, startled by the sight of Rachel sitting alone on the couch. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face a portrait of grief. She looked up at me, her expression raw, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "Please, Rachel," I said, my voice flat. "I'm just here to get a few things." She nodded, swallowing hard, but her eyes followed me as I moved from room to room. I could feel her presence behind me, a quiet desperation in her gaze as she clung to the last shreds of hope. But I had no intention of feeding it. I'd gathered most of my belongings when she finally spoke, her voice a shaky whisper. "Kyle, I know you hate me, and I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need to know, why did you do it? Why did you expose everything?" I paused, letting the question hang between us. She'd shattered the life we'd built, and yet she still wanted answers. Part of me wanted to walk out, to leave her in silence, but another part, a deeper part, maybe, felt she needed to hear the truth. I turned to face her, my gaze steady. "I did it because you needed to see what you destroyed. I wanted you to feel what it was like to have your world fall apart because of someone else's choices. You lied, Rachel. You lied to me, to your family, to your friends. You betrayed everyone who trusted you." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, her shoulders slumping. "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I did, and I've lost everything because of it. My friends, my family, they don't even look at me the same way." I nodded slowly. That was the point. She looked down, defeated, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, the faint echo of the love we'd once shared. But it was drowned by the memory of her betrayal, the words and actions that had turned my life upside down. The sympathy faded, leaving only a cold emptiness in its place. I slung the last of my belongings over my shoulder, preparing to leave. "Goodbye, Rachel." She looked up, her face a portrait of pain. "Kyle, please, if there's even a chance, if you could just—" "There isn't." I cut her off, my voice final. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. Goodbye." I walked out without looking back, feeling the weight of that final moment sink in. The door closed behind me, the soft click like a full stop at the end of a long, painful sentence. Months passed. I'd found a new place on the other side of town, a small apartment that felt foreign at first but became a welcome retreat. I threw myself into work, into the gym, into building a life that no longer included Rachel. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, slowly rediscovering myself in a world without her. I heard snippets about her from mutual acquaintances. Apparently, she tried to reach out to her friends, tried to explain her side of the story, but her reputation was tainted. The affair, the lies. They left a stain that no apology could wash away. People were polite, maybe, but distant. She was no longer the woman everyone admired. She was the woman who'd betrayed the trust of those closest to her. The last I heard, Ben had left town, jobless and alone. His own family had turned their backs on him, and whatever connection he and Rachel had once shared was as hollow and broken as the promises they'd made to each other. As far as I knew, she was still living in the same house, alone with the memories of what we'd once had and the reality of what she'd lost. As for me, I was finally moving on. The ache of betrayal had dulled, replaced by a quiet resolve, a new strength I hadn't known I was capable of. The revenge I'd taken, the justice I'd sought, it hadn't erased the pain, but it had allowed me to close that chapter, to find peace on my own terms. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the city lights flicker below, my phone buzzed with a message. I glanced down, seeing her name on the screen, but I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Whatever she had to say, it was too late. Her words, her apologies, her regrets, they held no power over me now. I deleted the message and slipped my phone back into my pocket, breathing in the cool night air. The darkness around me felt vast, endless, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. It felt like freedom. I was finally free. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.